Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Coronavirus Live Discussions. May I say, first of all, that it would be great if you could encourage your friends to hold a watch party, that is, if you're on Facebook. And if you're following us on either YouTube or Facebook, then do encourage your friends to watch the program as well. We're going to start with my introducing our two main speakers, but after that we shall see how things go. So first of all, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Al Erisman, who's got up specially early in the morning, all the way west in Seattle, to be able to participate in our program this morning. And you can see he's looking bright and cheerful, as he always does. Al is, in addition to what it says about him on the screen, also executive in residence at Seattle Pacific University. He is the executive editor of Ethics magazine, which focuses on issues of business ethics. And he has been and is, in fact, director of Kairos, which is a grouping of business leaders in the Seattle area. So that's Dr. Al Erisman, who will be speaking to us first, and then the next person to speak to us will be Dr. Ram GIDOOMAL. Now, as Al was saying, as we grow older, one of the challenges is that a short introduction to yourself becomes longer. And I think this is particularly true for Ram. There are many, many things that can be said about him. But in case you're puzzled by the letters CBE after his name, it means that he was decorated by the Queen. And that is a particular decoration that is given by the Queen in recognition of services rendered to the community or rendered to science or whatever. In his case, it was services to the community. And he has indeed been very active in that. But he has also been a member of the Parliamentary and Health Services Ombudsman. He has been on the Council of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. He has been chairman of the Lausanne movement, for those of you who know what that is. He has been, I could go on, International Justice Mission and so on, many, many things he's been involved in his life. So I think it's probably time for us to go to the presentations. So may I invite Al to start? And as he does, I would like us who are watching the program to keep in mind two questions. First, what is the framework that is being used by Dr. Erisman in terms of his decision-making? And secondly, is that decision-making framework something that could be useful to me? The context, of course, for our discussions is that we have been confronted by major figures, presidents, prime ministers, floundering in terms of their decision-making because they've not known how to respond to the fact that they're confronted with a serious situation in relation to which the evidence that is presented to them is either partial or certainly incomplete and quite often contradictory, or at least pointing in different directions. So how do you make a decision when you know that the information on which your decision is based is incomplete, fragmentary, contradictory? But of course, this is a very common situation in business. It may not be quite so common in politics, but it's certainly very common in business. And so we have two outstanding business leaders who will be able to share their framework with us. So Al, can I invite you to do your presentation, please? We can't hear you, Al. Sorry, we can't hear you at the moment.
Good morning and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction, Prabhu. We are confronted today with the pandemic that is worldwide, that is trying to be understood by scientists who are discovering new things every day. And all of us have perhaps experienced a lockdown of some sort where our lives have been changed dramatically. For many people, however, the health issue is only one thing. There are other issues. In fact, the economic issue is a huge thing that many people have faced. In the United States, the unemployment rate jumped to almost 20%. So as a result, we have an environment where there is unemployment, where there is a threat of a disease, and then we have other issues. Dr. Francis Collins at the National Institutes of Health has pointed out that this is a time of great mental health challenge as we navigate new ways of socializing. We even introduced a term that isn't very helpful called social distancing. It should be called physical distancing because we as people need to be careful about spreading the disease, but at the same time, we must remain socially connected. That's part of how we are made. So, how does a leader make a decision? In one area, they need to understand something about the science. And many people have difficulty with the scientific part because they hear someone say something in March and then they hear someone say something in May and it sounds different. And it is different because we've learned something. That's the nature of science. But nonetheless, science is involved in this thinking. But all of the other factors are involved as well. I got thinking about this question of how do we bring disparate ideas together to make a decision where no single thing is primary, but everything must be involved. We love in this age of tweets and other things to reduce things to very simple form, almost to slogans. But the fact is, this is a complex problem that doesn't allow for simple solutions. What do? And I thought back to my time at the Boeing Company, where we think about what it takes to make an airplane. And if you don't mind, I'd like to show you a picture of what it looks like in making an airplane. There are many factors that go into making this airplane. And if we could bring up that first slide, I would like to show you that from different points of view, you see an airplane differently. Suppose your expertise is in aerodynamics. That is, how do I get an airplane that will sleekly fly through the air, go a long distance, do it very efficiently, and it looks like just a sleek wing. That's what an aerodynamicist view of an airplane is. But if I'm a structures person, I have to be concerned about safety and reliability and making sure that this airplane will hold together. And it looks almost like a building with I-beams and other things that will support its structure and make sure that the airplane is safe and that it can fly reliably over 25 years with many takeoffs and landings. But suppose I'm a finance person. I approach the idea of an airplane with the question of cost. How much will it cost and will the airline be able to buy it? How does a leader bring these disparate ideas together to create one single solution? It turns out it's very, very difficult, but it requires a way of taking all of the ideas that I've just mentioned and bring them together in such a way that they all come together not as an aerodynamics wing, not as a structure, not as a low-cost product, but as an airplane that is affordable, reliable, and that people want to fly in. And that requires melding different ideas. I think the key to thinking about an airplane is the idea that all of these pieces need to come together. What does that require? Well, the first thing it requires is something that's very difficult for experts. I'm an expert in aerodynamics. I don't know much about this structure stuff and I don't care. And those finance people are just getting in the way. But the fact is, I have to make my knowledge subservient to a bigger set of knowledge and to a bigger goal. And the goal is this airplane. And as a result, what ends up happening in these meetings is that people bring each of their own expertise to the question, but at the same time, they say, these 5 things are important to me. This one, I could give up a little bit. And the other person says, but that, if you give up a little bit there, I can make a lot of gain in my area. And so together we can put together an airplane that will address all of our concerns as well as possible. So this idea of bringing different disciplines together, different thinking together, is absolutely essential to creating a solution to a complex problem. You see, we have 2 problems today. One problem is that we want to short circuit expertise. You've all probably been in the situation where you go to a physician and the physician says you should do this, and you say, but I read on the internet that I could do that. And it's almost like we're pitting one set of knowledge against another. We need deep expertise. But at the same time, these different areas of expertise must come together. Now, let's think about our COVID situation. As I watch leaders trying to make decisions, I hear them listening to the infectious disease modelers who are saying, if you have this kind of behavior, you will get this kind of infectious disease spread, and it will be this kind of a problem. And so we go into a lockdown. But then we have businesses who say, because of the lockdown, we are going bankrupt. The economy for the whole country is at risk, and we have a problem. And so the leader says, well, I guess we ought to open up then. And in opening up, you violate the first one. Off on the side, without much of a voice, is the behavioral scientist who observes that in spite of the lockdown, some people are going to defy this and say, this is about me, and I'm going to behave this way whether you like it or not. And alongside that are the mental health people who are saying the suicides that come in because of this virus are maybe as bad as the virus. What are we going to do about mental health? And then, of course, there's the law and justice, and how is it carried out? Do you see the picture of how that relates to an airplane? We have areas of expertise that involve mental health, that involve infectious disease, that involves law and justice, that involves behavioral sciences. And all of these need to come together to create a solution. We have been ratcheting back and forth between these for a period of time. And I think it's time to set a goal together of saying, what does it take to create a flourishing society in the face of a pandemic? And how do we bring these ideas together to create policy that would allow us to best navigate something that is very difficult? This would mean a common goal. It would mean humility on the part of experts in these areas as they come together around decision making. And then I admit I am a follower of Jesus, and I think about the instruction that I get from the Bible. And there's a story, a historical account actually in the Bible that talks about a king who was ill. And the Bible says of him, he looked only to the physicians, but didn't look to God. And as I think about that, I say, I think there's a spiritual component to this problem also. And I think coming together means addressing all of the pieces I talked about with some spiritual component involved. And so, as a follower of Jesus, I have been praying with humility that we would understand, that we would listen to each other, and that we would maybe see something that we have never seen before. If I could wrap up with this one thought. I recently did some research on the development of a company that had conflicting objectives. They had one objective to help people grow and develop, and they had another objective, which was to grow profitably. And sometimes those are in conflict. And the question is, how do you handle conflicting objectives? Exactly as I've been talking. And the leader of the Ken Hansen, at the time when they were first talking about this, says, think about an exercise band. Think about stretching this out and making it tense. He said, one thing you know for sure, you don't let go of either end because it will hit you in the face. So what you have to do instead is use that tension to drive creative solutions to address this problem. Going back to COVID-19, how do we think about the tension between economics, disease spread, and mental health? And ask ourselves, what do we do in driving the tension that creates solutions we could not have come up with before? So I think we need this framework for decision making that has experts not turning their individual solutions over to leaders to make decisions, but working the technical problem of bringing things together to create a solution that best navigates toward a common goal. Thanks.
Nonprofits and so on, we have leaders. And of course, the question is, does the leader have the ability to also have humility to listen and to set that common goal and to encourage people to contribute and so on? So, but we'll explore those thoughts further and we'll discuss with you in a moment. But let me go straight on to Ram. Dr. Ram GIDOOMAL, I've introduced him to you earlier. And Ram, it's your turn to speak, if you don't mind taking the microphone now.
Thank you, Prabhu. I know you had some questions that you were prepared to ask me, but if I just respond to what I've heard Dr. Ralph Erisman say, which I really appreciated hearing his approach in terms of decision making, bringing different strands together. My experience has been different. I've always, seriously, always been put in positions where I've had to come in when there is a crisis. So, for example, our family are a family of refugees. When India was partitioned, we had to flee overnight and set up, leave all our wealth and assets and start from scratch with that shock to the system and a large family to see now, so how do we now handle that particular pandemic of a migration crisis, if I can put the terms in equivalence? Well, we are business people. And so as business people, what we have to see is opportunity and not problems. The problems are there, everybody's facing it. So I was, of course, just born at the time. 20 years later, we were again forced to migrate from East Africa to Britain. So that experience is vivid and fresh in my mind. What did we do? 15 of us, 4 bedrooms. We bought a corner shop, a business. Now, that same business and a series of these businesses were being shut down along the street where we landed. And as fast as they were being shut down, we were buying them. Why? Because we saw opportunity. Where the previous owners of the shops were seeing economic decline, a problem in an area declining, we saw an opportunity. What did we see with with a different set of eyes, but the same information? We saw a community of migrants from Ireland who were coming into that area for rebuilding the area. So we started producing goods, supplying goods for them. So what do you miss from Ireland? What can we get you? Market research, information, data. Of course, we don't have it all, but whatever we did have, we used. And within 2 years from one shop, we had 6 shops. Now, I come to the pandemic today. One business I chair, TRAIDCRAFT PLC, has been around for the last 40 years dealing in fair trade. It is a response to poverty that was driven by a response to what Jesus always said about the poor, saying, what is it that we must do to make sure that the poor are provided for and cared for in society? So this business was set up to ensure that those poor folk, wherever they were, had hope in producing goods that we could sell into Western markets. Now, over the years, it has succeeded phenomenally. We have succeeded in getting Nestle to produce fairly traded Kit Kat We have succeeded in challenging Cadbury's to produce fairly traded Maltesers and so on. So that's been a sort of campaigning business type of thing. Now, in the most recent pandemic crisis, something very peculiar happened again. Businesses are under pressure, businesses are laying people off. But what we had, which was fascinating, is the ability, a chief executive in place and a team who could switch the business model as, and that was what was required. How can you adapt and be agile, even though you're a 40-year-old business with all the culture and heritage that could drag you down? How can you ensure you're agile? Well, what we did was, instead of a B2B business, which is what we were, selling to other businesses who sold on, we switched. This was incredible. You can call it a fortuitous set of circumstances that people discovered that there was one product we were selling, which we have always sold for the last 30, 40 years, as a loss leader to make sure that when people come to buy that product, they add a whole range of other products. That product was toilet rolls. Now, you all know what happened during this pandemic. Everybody wanted toilet rolls. We had a warehouse full of toilet rolls. The result was consumers who found that out came to us online to order these goods. And before we knew it, we were getting hundreds of orders. So from getting a few customers, we now have lots of customers. And we had to switch our business model from B2B to B2C. We did it. We learned lessons along the way. You said earlier in the introduction, do we have all the information? No. One big bit of information we were missing was that when you switch from B2B to B2C, directly to a consumer, your postage rate and your mailing rate has to switch. Well, we didn't. So in the first few days, we started seeing a bit of a strange result where instead of making money, we were just still holding even. But what's happening here? Get the postage right. Customers must be rubbing their hands saying, oh, this is great. We're getting something for cheap. So we switched the postage prices. And over this period of the pandemic, this company has seen the best 3 months of its history for this period. Our biggest profit is made during Christmas, and that's it. We extended from Christmas to now, and it's continuing still. I mean, we have challenges ahead. We still do not know, in terms of information, what the future holds. So far, so good. But what will the future be? How do we go? Now, that's what we are watching. And here I must say, one particular book that really helped us, a sort of method of working, which we used to switch from a previous way of working to now. And I don't have time to tell you about it, but I would say Google the word holocracy. And we have developed a holocratic management style, which has paid dividends. And a book that really inspired us, which we used again very quickly in the last 18 months, getting an entire team to switch the way it works and thinks from 40 years of culture to a new way of thinking called Be More Pirate. The title speaks for itself. And again, using that, this company has really been able to handle the turnaround. And not only this, 2 other companies I chair. Another one I chair is called ALLIA. That company started again about 20 years ago to address the issue of unemployment. Because at the moment, what we are seeing with this pandemic is a big consequence of this pandemic is actually unemployment. Well, this company was set up 20 years ago in Britain when unemployment was at its highest level. What we did using a fascinating financial structure was to issue bonds with local communities investing and businesses investing, because they would then get their money back. It's a bond. But the dividend from the bond usually is, which we provided, was there will be housing or there will be employment, both big issues at times of crises. Again, we've seen an incredible boom in the issue of these bonds, which are all secure. So this isn't a sort of pyramid scheme or anything like that. These are solid, secure bonds with first-class banks who are engaged in the process. And we are seeing a growth in the issue of bonds, where when we started and we were seeing 5 or 10 million, we are now over 500 million pounds and rising even as I speak. Again, we are entering the pandemic with a strong balance sheet and a good cash balance, which has meant that we haven't had to make as many unemployed as we might otherwise have had to, and managing the whole furloughing scheme in a way that is honoring to the workers and ensuring that we are taking advantage of public policy, but doing it in a responsible manner. And again, I go on to the third company, Cotton Connect, which I'm chairman of. There again, that works with farmers in China and India, Pakistan, and now Egypt. Again, there, farmers would be hugely impacted by the pandemic. Again, how do you respond in terms of this pandemic to the public policy that is now being put in place? Again, in a fascinating way, the farmers have continued, but it has called for training. It has called for ensuring health and safety. It has called for different methods of farming to ensure that, as a term has been used earlier, social distancing, well, physical distancing, cleanliness, hygiene, again, in languages that are different. We've had people in China and South Asia and Africa. So being able to work, so the words like agile, nimble, flexibility become key when you have a sort of crisis and a sort of pandemic like this, to be able to respond. And if I use the word take advantage of, it is it maybe could be misconstrued as taking advantage of a bad situation, but working within a situation that appears to be causing, if I use the word tragedy, because unemployment is a tragedy in any society, because work brings dignity. How do we ensure that we keep that going during this pandemic? And to me, it is about looking at the same set of information others are looking at and saying, so now what can we do? Do not let what we cannot do stop us from doing what we can do. Because there's a great book that has been referred to already called the Bible, the book with the teachings of Jesus, where he talks about the parable of the talents. What's a parable? A story where he gives to three people, one, two, and 5 talents. Just for argument's sake, if I use those numbers, he comes back. He says that the master comes back and asks, "What did you do with the talent?" And what is fascinating is to see the different response from each of the people he gave the talent to. With the one saying, "I went and buried it." Well, the last thing we do in this pandemic is go and bury our talent. It's use that talent to see what can we do to make a difference in the society that we're a part of and which we can serve, so that we can make that difference to prevent disaster and tragedy growing and bringing opportunity and hope in an otherwise what would seem to be an impossible situation. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And before we go into the sort of question time and discussion between the three of us and then with the audience, may I just invite the audience, those of you who don't know, maybe with us for the first time, to a special welcome to you if you're here for the first time. But if you are here for the first time, you may want to note, if you're listening on Facebook or on YouTube, that you can actually ask questions using chat on those media. Or if you don't like using those media and you want to email the questions to us directly, then please do so. And the questions can be sent to info, I-N-F-O, info at Truth and Transformation, one word, truthandtransformation.org. So you can email us or you can use chat on Facebook or YouTube to ask your questions. And then I will try to use some of the questions in terms of discussions with us. But I'm sure there'll be just questions we won't be able to get around to. And if there are such questions, I hope that we'll be able to respond to you afterwards. So just to turn to our two speakers, Ram and Al. Ram, you heard Al talk about the necessity for experts to be willing to bring their expertise to the service of, not just say, this is my point of view, this should win, but actually use it almost as an offering in service of this wider goal. And of course, you have very interestingly shared your experience of being in a crisis situation where you either brought those new pairs of eyes that saw opportunity or encouraged and enabled others to have this sort of eyes by which they could look at opportunity. Now, when you listen to the framework which Al put forward, does it strike you as anything new or different? Or is it something you've seen in action? What is your response to the kind of framework that Al put forward?
The framework that Al put forward in an interesting way in terms of structure is very much a structure intuitively that I suppose I have personally followed in the businesses I've been with. So to give you an example, Prabhu, Another business I ran, and which I no longer run, was in seafoods, specialty seafoods. Now, I know nothing about seafoods. I get into the business, I try and learn, but what helped me was having around the table experts, different experts, an expert in handling cold storage, an expert in buying, an expert in sales and marketing. And so you have these range of experts and more. My role then was to see now how do I draw them together. Now, intuitively or interestingly, what starts happening is people begin to think they're experts of the other's sphere. And my role was very much to watch that. To give you a classic example, we came to a point where there was a problem in the pricing of one particular product, Scampi, from one of the ports in Scotland where our factories were. So we went round the table. The question asked in this decision was, do we raise the price that we pay to the fishermen? Do we reduce the price with the risks? Or what do we do? So as we went round the table, the almost unanimous view around the table was we should reduce the price. And I thought about it. I said, hang on, I've got here a buying expert for fish. He has just shared the same decision quality time of 2 minutes as they all did. He heard the others' views. His view was contrary. Now, do I go with the majority? How do I make this decision? And then I realized, I said, hang on, I'm paying that man X 100,000 a year. He's the expert. Surely he should get the brunt of the time of any decision we have to make. So I stopped it and said, right, tell me, Foster, what do you really think in terms of the pricing and why are you saying what you're saying? Can you explain it in the extra time I'm giving, despite the big agenda and the busy time and the crisis we face? He took a full half hour. He explained his thinking. He explained his logic. All the others sitting around the table, I then went around and said, what do you say? Well, everyone switched their view from a hard-nosed, cut the price to, hey, it makes sense to increase the price. Let's go with him and let's see where we land. Well, we survived. We actually ended up being leaders in that field. And my point here is more how the decision was arrived at taught me one big lesson. When you have less experts around the table and you're looking at an issue relating to one particular expertise, give that person maximum airtime. Let us all listen humbly. And even if we have made a view known that was contrary, let's be prepared to listen to the expert. Of course, you allow critique, you allow challenge, but for me not to have allowed him that extra time made me feel, what am I doing here? But that happens over time when you get used to one another around the board table, and you always tend to forget because everybody thinks that they can be experts. So I think that's just one practical example where I've used that. Yeah.
Now, Al, do you feel that in the current situation in the world, perhaps particularly in the United States, this business of bringing your expertise to the table and offering it really in service of a bigger goal, this has become more difficult because of political polarization and fragmentation?
There's no question about that, Prabhu. There is no question that some of the issues that would take us through this pandemic have been politicized. But there's also an issue of leadership, and I want to pick up on something that Ram said. Ram was willing to listen to the expertise of someone else and gave them the authority to use their expertise. I talked with one of the infectious disease modelers, and I said, to what extent would you be able to say, if we looked at the problem another way, maybe we can control the spread but allow more economic freedom? And he said, that's not my position, and I'm not allowed to speak up in that area. In fact, he said one time I was asked by one of the leaders, could you cut the data in another way? He had this idea. And he did it. It didn't prove anything, and they went on. And then he said to me, but if we had cut it yet another way, we could have found something. And I said to him, why didn't you speak up? And he said, I value my job, and the environment was such that I didn't feel I could speak up. So I think a very key point that Ram just made was creating a culture and an environment where people can have this honest debate and actually raise questions they were not asked so that you can explore territory that you wouldn't find otherwise. So I think the culture plays a really important role here. In fact, I would push it just a little further and say that I think most leaders today are not experts in all of the things that they lead. And that willingness to listen to expertise and to be able to explore with them and allow them the freedom to raise questions is actually essential to being able to produce this product in this complex environment, whether it's an airplane or a policy for COVID.
So that's one side of the equation, of course, the leader's responsibility to make sure that sort of atmosphere is created in which dissent is possible, in which people can fly kites, so to speak, can come up with speculative ideas that they don't know are necessarily going to lead to a solution, but might. That kind of open, innovative, risk-taking sort of atmosphere is something only a leader can create. That is what a leader is paid to do. The leader is not paid to be an expert in all the things that he or she is leading. The leader is paid to create an atmosphere in which the experts can be at their best, almost beyond their expertise. So that's one side of it. But the other side of it is, isn't it, what used to be called civil courage? That means knowing that your responsibility is not just to represent what you know, but your job is to be there thinking beyond your expertise for what will be for the common good. And isn't it the case that political polarization of this sort and sometimes actions by leaders shut down that kind of civil courage and reduce that kind of civil courage? What is the role of individuals in maintaining that civil courage and being willing to speak up and being willing to put their jobs on the line and indeed their lives on the line if necessary in order to shift the debate in the right direction? Ram, would you like to respond to
that? Because at a very personal level, so this is going to be very personal, Prabhu, but exactly that issue hit me as a businessman. I was now in London. I'd been in Geneva, then Scotland, France, now in London. And operating in London, I attended a business meeting where with civil servants, the public policy officials, where I was shown a map of London from 1890, a poverty map and a wealth map, and then a 1990 poverty and wealth. And when they overlaid it, there was very little difference. And that made me think 100 years. I know that in the 100 years, millions, if not hundreds of millions, have been poured into the economy. Why has there been no shift in that relative poverty wealth index within London? So I did what you said is, what do you do as an individual? I decided I would hand over the reins at the business to a whole team and take time out to challenge the political machinery of the day. And the Prime Minister then, Tony Blair, had just set up a new initiative for mayors for cities, something that had not been here in the United Kingdom, unlike the United States, where you always had mayors in cities. So I said, right, I will throw my hat in the ring and see what I can do. And now, the reality told me that I can't fight the big machines of either the Republican Democrat or the Labour Conservative, but by engaging in the political space, let me see what I could do to shift the agenda. So at the very first meeting, when there were 15 candidates who wanted to be mayor of London, so each one spoke in 3 minutes. What are you going to do for London? And they all spoke about the classic: transport, housing, crime, big issues, maybe education, maybe health. Well, I got up to speak, and I suppose in my mind, I kept thinking, I'm not a politician, I'm a businessman, but I'm also one who follows the teachings of Jesus. And I know the impact that Jesus' teachings have had in terms of dealing with poverty. So my mind was thinking, what would Jesus do? You know, the classic thing that people have heard about. And I said, I'm running this because I came as a refugee in London. I feel for that disadvantaged community. So my 3 minutes was spent on talking about the homeless, the jobless, and the carless, and what I would do for them. The applause from that room just hit the roof. And later that night, when the leading politicians were asked what were the big issues for London, guess what they said? The homeless, the jobless, and the carless. Now, why am I making this point? By engaging in the political space, I had shifted the agenda. Suddenly, for the next period, every candidate was talking about what will they do for the homeless. So my point here is engage in that political space, and that is what I did with my time and energy. Yes, it cost me dear. I look back and know that, but that doesn't matter. There is the benefit side where for the first time in the campaign, the poor, the homeless, the jobless, raising money, setting up a fund to make sure that jobs were created for them, that housing was made available where otherwise no one was talking about it. I think so to me, that my message is not just that, oh, I did it, aren't I clever? No, every single one of us has a duty and an obligation to respond. And in this pandemic crisis in particular, this isn't about just a big idea and the big deal and all what we may see on the media. At our local community level, what is it that we can do to make that difference? Let us step out and do what we can, because that will be the difference, and maybe sadly the only difference that we will ever see.
We have a third speaker, as it were, who's been in the wings, and if I may bring him in, Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi. Vishal, if you're there and can come on screen, that would be great. Thank you. Dr. Vishal Mangalwadi is, in a way, the host of this series, and the series has been created partly at his instigation. Vishal started life as a philosopher, or was trained as a philosopher. His first book was on philosophy, etc. And he then moved from mere philosophy, so to speak, to agricultural and rural development. And he moved from that, because he realized it wasn't going anywhere, into political activism, because he saw that any kind of rural reconstruction is not possible if the politics isn't right. So he moved into political activism. And when he moved into political activism, he realized this is very difficult to shift as an individual or as a small group. So he then moved into social reform, because unless you can build changes up from the grassroots, nothing moves at the political level. So he's been through the whole circle, as it were, or the whole cycle, and he's still involved in all those things in different ways. But I guess his main claim to fame at the moment is as an author. He's the author of 21 books, which are available in 15 different languages, 6 European languages, 6 Indian languages, and 3 Far Eastern languages. So, Vishal, may I ask you to just respond to the question? You've lived in the slums, you've experienced the slums, you've lived in a rural area, you've been involved with disasters in India, helping, reconstruction after disasters and so on. You've been involved in all these areas. What is your response to this question of decision-making in hard times and role of leaders and civil courage? Anything at all in these areas that you want to speak to?
Well, thank you very much. It is wonderful to listen to two very experienced people, and it is very clear right now that during COVID-19 that I was stranded in the US. I was supposed to be in India, Europe, and Africa, but so watching the tremendous struggle here in America, which is so polarized, so divided, that many people are openly talking about the possibility of another civil war, that potentially it is there, that yes, the leader has to reconcile these many pulls and pressures where people are committed not just to their vested interests, as the slavery became a big issue in the first Civil War, the only Civil War that the US has, and now racism became part of the issue in this COVID-19, that much of the pent-up feelings being locked down, expressing themselves on the street. But this time behind the fight of racism has been the issue of ideology, that people may not be committed to their economic vested interest, but to their ideology, and that a leader has his ideas, and those who are opposing him have their ideas. And this requires ability to listen and respond to those ideas. So the part of leadership is bringing healing in a nation, in a society in conflict. No war is civil. When we call a civil war civil, what we mean is that a family is destroying itself, a company is destroying itself, a nation, a society is destroying itself. And so bringing a healing touch is part of a leader's great responsibility. And particularly when the conflict is over ideas and ideology, then a very important responsibility of the leader would be to listen to what is behind the slogans, the ideas that are behind the slogans. And so the overt issues in COVID-19 have been health, death, economy, jobs, mental health. But particularly in America, we're now faced with ideologies that have 100 years history of being taught in schools, colleges, universities, media. And this would be an important area for a leader if he is to bring a healing touch to allow in the context of an uncivil war, a civil discussion and debate. So civility coming where people are allowed to express their opinions, not just by burning and pulling down statues and monuments and buildings, but in fact arguing their case and then it would take humility and repentance. We've just this week celebrated 4th of July. 4th of July 1776, what happened was that USA became free from British colonialism, but the slaves remained slaved in chains. And so the current conflict go that far back, 1776. It took 60, 70 years to end slavery through a civil war, but before that civil war was 40 years of preaching that slavery is sin, and we need to repent, we need to oppose it. But then it took another century to end racial segregation, at least legally, if not in the hearts and minds of people. And in this situation now, a public policy of how to bring healing into the hearts and minds of people to reunite the family. This is the big challenge of a leader, because he is not simply making his company or making his community great, but he is bringing actually repentance and reconciliation and healing. So this role of public leadership, public policy, is very important, and many people feel that if the aim is to make your nation great in material terms, but if you can't bring healing in relationships, in communities, particularly when divisions are so ideological, that would take another set of skills.
Yeah. So Vishal, the point you're making is a very important one, and you've used big words like repentance and reconciliation. And what you're talking about is the need to turn from your self-interest, to turn from your own, as a leader, to turn away from your own self-interest, to turn away from your own desire for power, continuing to be CEO or president or prime minister or whatever, turn away from the interests of your particular party turn away even from your own political interests, but really fix your eyes on what is good for everyone. Now, this used to be the tradition. So when somebody became a president or a CEO, he or she generally knew that they had to leave their previous position and interests and so on behind. They were now in a new position. And therefore, in this new position, they had to adopt a new mental framework, a new set of values, a new behavior, even a new dress quite often, right? But that sort of sense of responsibility that comes with new positions and new levels in hierarchies and so on, that seems to have completely gone. And people are more and more simply using positions for their own interest. And this is true whether one looks at private companies, you look at the behavior of CEOs or people on boards. This is true whether you look at countries and the members of cabinet or political leaders. You think of people simply voting more and more money to themselves as members of parliament at a time when workers are losing money. So you find selfish behavior becoming entrenched rather than unselfish behavior becoming entrenched. What do you see roots of this phenomenon, and how can we reverse it?
Characters that come to mind are Mahatma Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln. Both of them in the movement of very badly divided nations. So India was being literally partitioned, to which Ram GIDOOMAL's family was a victim of that partition. And the conflict was primarily between Hindus and Muslims, but Sikhs were also involved. And Mahatma Gandhi was willing to lay down his life deliberately by fasting unto death at times to challenge the intense hatreds of one community against the other. But also he was ultimately assassinated during a prayer meeting where he is doing what we were reminded of, turning to God, that this problem of hatred is much greater than what a man or a leader can solve. It has to be God's work in our spirit. So he was assassinated. Then Abraham Lincoln, of course, who is trying to end slavery in a very badly divided nation, also is assassinated and killed. Now that is what Jesus called as taking up your cross. So Europe, if today we see Europe as a civilized part of the world, it was very brutal. And what transformed much 1,000 years before Islam was born, Europe was the center of terrorism. Europe, through Alexander the Great, from Greece, or Augustus Caesar, terror was exported, and cross was the symbol of European terrorism, of subduing people. And then Jesus asked his followers to take up their cross in transforming the kingdom of Satan into kingdom of God. This is the old vocabulary of, you can call it the kingdom of darkness and kingdom of light, or kingdom of hatred with kingdom of love. Cross became the mark of a leader, the willingness to take up your cross. And of course, Tom Holland, an agnostic, has argued this in Britain very well in his book Dominion, of how the cross transformed Europe, and which is what you're saying, that a leader has to rise above his self-interest. And the self-interest could be small, that I want to be the president of a nation or prime minister of a nation, or the self-interest could be commitment to my race, my ethnicity, or whatever. But laying down your life for reconciliation, this would be part of leadership in this context. So cross would be a symbol of a solution.
And of course, there are people in many countries, in many historical periods, in many civilizations, who have in effect carried the cross, even though they may never have heard of Jesus, or they may never have heard of his teachings. And equally, there are people who have heard his teachings, probably from childhood, but have never really practiced this business of self-sacrifice, or of taking on themselves the responsibility of serving the community as a whole. Al, any comments in relation to that? I can't hear
Yes,
you.
yes. So I love the attention to the leader, laying aside self-interest, and this idea that Jesus actually talked about of servant leadership. It's not ruling it over others, but enabling others to flourish. It's setting your own thoughts aside. But I also believe that this extends to everyone in the organization. So you were talking earlier about the person who's in the bottom of the organization. They don't have power, but they do have power because they know something about an area that other people don't know about. And that's a form of power that is strongly impacting organizations and decisions. These people also need to lay aside their power and be willing to work together toward a common goal. So, this concept of humility certainly is important for the leader, but it flows through to the person in the organization. And even if the leadership doesn't provide this kind of culture and environment, it's amazing what little bit of influence can be used by people in an organization to say, I'm willing to speak up on this issue, even though I haven't been asked, even though I know that it might cost me something, it's that important. So while I applaud the idea of making sure that this is present among leaders, I encourage it also among other people who are contributing.
Now, questions have been coming in from our participants on the program, on Facebook, on YouTube, and so on. And there are some interesting questions from somebody who calls herself or himself Song of Cyrena from Los Angeles, and a question from David James, and a question from Paulo Ediel Silva Carvalho, and SK, somebody who just identifies herself or himself as SK. And these questions, of course, are of many different sorts. But the most interesting question is, in some ways, and it comes to this question that we were all raising about the spiritual nature of the challenge. If you're not somebody who believes in God and so on, you think of spiritual things as being airy-fairy. But think of them as the deep things of the heart. And the deep things of the heart only change in a way when we are willing to change, and when some power from outside ourselves, we can call it unselfishness, love, God, Jesus, whatever, somehow influences us to change. What is the role of talking to God in the middle of all this? You, Al, mentioned that, yes, there is something about talking to God in the middle of your decision making. Can you think of an instance in your life, in your decision making life, when talking to God made a difference?
I could think of quite a number of them, but one time, a very personal decision where my career was kind of put on the sideline through a leader that I had helped promote, and he didn't. He, I think, was threatened, and so he demoted me. And the real question was, what do I do about that? I had many opportunities. I thought about leaving the company, and I did pray about this and made a decision to stay. I made a decision to try to work out how to navigate this in a very broken time. I'm not hearing you, Prabhu.
Muted, yes. Okay. When you talked to God about this issue of shall I leave or shan't I leave, what actually happened? What led you to the decision you took? Did you hear a voice? Did something happen? What exactly happened that caused you to decide A rather than B?
I don't fully know the answer to that. It's a great question. I remember on the day that I had to make a decision that I said, Dear God, if you want me to go, I'll go. If you want me to stay, I will stay. Please tell me. And it seemed like there was silence. I made a decision to stay. And a number of months later, I looked back at that decision and realized I had had a phone call from my pastor the night before I made the decision, and he encouraged me to stay. And I was waiting for a voice an audible voice from God. And I believe God did speak to me through my pastor. It influenced my decision, but I didn't fully recognize it at the time. I think often this is the case, that we can we can desire a decision. We'd love to see this written in lights. Sometimes I think God gives us the choice ourselves, and sometimes he speaks to us through others. And that was a life-changing thing for me. My career at the Boeing company changed dramatically not long after that, to opportunities that I had. It doesn't always work that way, but I was thankful and I did commit that one to God.
So I think my view is that that was the key. When you said, I'll stay if you want me to stay, I'll go if you want me to go, that was the key. You had surrendered your self-interest to the wider interest. And then God was able to guide you, even though you were not conscious that you were being guided. But Ram, maybe you want to share an experience of how God guided you in terms of your decision making, maybe not in the way that Alice shared, but in different ways.
Yeah, there's a range probably that I could share, but the one right early in my career, when I was put in charge while my boss was traveling and it was the weekend, Friday, and he said, "Look, not much will happen. I'm away for the weekend. If there's any decision, obviously you take it. You won't be able to get in touch with me." So the phone rings. A supplier calls me from Paris. I'm in Geneva. "Look, your company ordered 20,000 cartons of sardines. They're ready in the Canary Islands. Failure to collect them is going to result in damages, storage costs, blah, blah, blah." He absolutely scared the life out of me. I said, "Oh my goodness." I said, "How quickly will they be ready?" He said, "Tuesday, maybe Wednesday." I thought, what do I do? So I called the shipping companies we deal with. I called up Hamburg. They said, "Yep, there is a ship." "Oh, you wanted to go to the Canary Islands?" "Oh, we can get it there by Wednesday. No problem. Tuesday even. We'll button the hatches and go." I then called the supplier and say, "Hey, you told me there's this thing. I got the ship coming. It's coming to you on Tuesday." He panicked now. He said, "Oh." I said, "You put pressure on me. You wanted the ship. It's there." He said, "Well, uh, they'll be ready. It'll take me a week still." I said, "But you just put me under extreme pressure. I'm now putting a ship of mine out to you. It's going to cost me X thousand dollars a day. What's going on here?" And my career at stake, my job at stake. I have to justify to my bosses, "Hey, I took a decision which was based on that information, which is misleading." But I'm new. They will believe. Who will they believe? So I just paused. It was Friday at noon, and I just, yep, spoke with God. There's very little I can do now. This is beyond redemption for me. I don't know what to do anymore. This is over to you, my Lord. I can't do anything more. That's it. I left the office at 5. Still remember, went to pick my wife up from where she was working. Popped in at 7 o'clock in the evening just to check the telexes. These are the days when we had telexes. And I heard the machine buzzing away profusely, suddenly coming out with this long telex. And guess what it said? "Oh, dear Ram, I know you called me to send this ship out, and then you had a subsequent call with the supplier saying this. You won't believe what's happened. In attempting to speed up, one of the cranes has hit the hatches. The hatch will no longer close. We have to repair it over the weekend. The earliest we can get it out, which is now our responsibility, not yours, so you don't face demerit charges, will be Tuesday or Wednesday next week. So it can get to the Canaries by Friday." I said, "Thank God." Thank the Lord. Thank that higher power. He somehow intervened here and made something happen beyond my own ability. And of course, I called the supplier, gave him a piece of my mind on Monday, but all honor was saved and the matter was resolved. But when it came to running for mayor of London, now that was a different decision. And when I had to make that decision, my answer was no, first. And my answer was, "I've got 6 other candidates who can go. Why me? I'm a businessman. Well, I'm not a politician. I don't know what you're talking about. I wouldn't know how to handle this, a minimum of what's going on in the political space." So my answer is no. But of course, when I shared with my wife, she said, "Look, uh, these are things that we refer to a higher authority for. Should we not talk to God about this and see what happens? My answer again was, okay, you talk as you will. I'm going to talk to him and say, please say no, and let's keep going. But the point was, we were put in a spirit of talking to God. I was certainly. And interestingly, what happened is this: I didn't hear a big voice from up there or a vow, a big message coming up saying, go do it. Day by day, my eyes began to open to the injustices in London. I shared earlier on about the rich poor divide. Well, there was a lot more that started hitting me. What started hitting me, for example, in terms of the United Kingdom now, let alone London, was the heritage that this country has on a set of values that are drawn from a book we call the Bible. And that became clearer to me. It's the opening of eyes day by day. So there wasn't a moment I said, I'm doing it. As it became clear to me that there are issues at stake here that are far bigger than just money, than just political power, but that it is influencing the agenda for the common good, for the people, that maybe it was time that I should take that risk and step forward and trust in that higher power to keep me on that journey. And indeed, that did happen when I saw the results from what happened with that whole election process. I was expecting a tarnished reputation, a damaged career, totally destroyed in the public square. Far from it. Doors opened that I didn't know existed. Opportunities came that I didn't know would ever arise for me. And it was just the most incredible positive answer in terms of that process of speaking with that higher authority who took me day by day and step by step as part of the decision making process.
So, Song of Sarina from Los Angeles asks the question. This sounds all very well, but asks the question. Adam Smith taught us, didn't he, that we should all seek our own self-interest. And so long as we all seek our own self-interest, the so-called invisible hand will make everything in the market work all right. And what you're talking about, of course, is something quite different from each of us seeking simply our self-interest. Um, Over since the 80s, I guess, there's been an increasing promotion of the point of view that we should all seek our own self-interest and everything will be all right. Selfishness is great. There is no such thing as community. Greed is good, and all the rest of it. Any reflections on that, Al?
Yes. I think we have to remember the context. When Adam Smith wrote what he wrote, years before, he had written another book called The Age of Moral Sentiment, where there was a foundation of a moral understanding of things. And this idea of self-interest within a moral framework is a very different thing than self-interest for self-interest's sake. What we have seen over the last 30, 40, 50 years is a shift in business toward self-interest and greed, which I think is behind almost every one of the major ethical scandals that we have seen in business. And I think it's due in part to self-interest without a moral framework, but it's also due to complexity because you can hide something. A meat seller in a village would sell you a bad piece of meat on one day, everyone in the village would know it the next day, and there was a self-correction that was very immediate. In a global world where issues are hidden by complexity, this self-correction is not as evident, and a person can exploit something over a long period of time. So I would argue that every business needs a purpose that is bigger than the money that they make, needs a purpose that's bigger than themselves. That puts this back into a moral framework in which you can operate. So the research that I did recently on the ServiceMaster company, they set a goal of delivering value to their employees and growing their employees that was ahead of the idea of making money. Did they make a lot of money? They made a lot of money. The results are incredible. But it was subservient to the idea of helping employees develop. I believe that this idea that we talk about from Adam Smith without the moral framework in this 21st century actually fails. And I would encourage businesses to think beyond themselves to what they are doing in society, what they are doing for their employees. And I believe the results will follow.
Well, I'd like to bring Vishal in on this point, but I just want to make the comment that actually businesses are beginning to think about the wider responsibility they have to society. There's a book just coming out called The Social License for Business, and so on. There's a conference just been held this last few days, sponsored by the British Academy, no less, on the purpose of business, businesses with a purpose, and so on. So there's a lot of thinking going on along these lines. And I wonder whether these kinds of initiatives will actually bear fruit, whether there's enough root, as it were, in the culture for this kind of transition to take place from selfishness and greed, which is what has been institutionalized in our society since the 80s, to a society in which we do, of course, look after our own interests, but not looking after our own interests at the cost of others, at the cost of society, the cost of the environment, and so on. But Vishal, your thoughts on whether we will be able to make a transition to this kind of a more, shall we call it, holistic society, and the chances of not actually being able to make it?
Well, thank you. Adam Smith's book was published in 1776, which is 200 years after Scotland had been reformed, where every child in Scotland had become used to praying, "Your kingdom, God's kingdom come, your will be done on earth," where every child memorized the 10 Commandments. You shall not covet. Greed is bad. Greed is sin. This was part of the ethos in Scotland. So as a theist, the Unitarian kind of theist, Adam Smith took the moral framework of his nation for granted. But since those moral foundations have been deleted, the roots have dried up, what are intellectuals, let alone praying to God, to believe that there is not one invisible hand, but there are two invisible hands. And there is an invisible hand which is saying greed is good. The other one had said, you shall not covet, greed is bad. So once capitalism, of course, Adam Smith didn't start capitalism, he systematized, he saw what had happened in Europe as a result of the Reformation of Europe turning to the scriptures, to the Bible. He was summarizing the spirit of capitalism. But once you have those moral foundations systematically destroyed by the universities, courts, schools, churches marginalized, you do not realize that there is another invisible spiritual hand which is anxious to turn nations into kingdom of Satan. What happened in Germany, the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation 100 years ago, when Germany became the arch villain of the 20th century, a kingdom of Satan. That is what will happen to capitalism without that moral framework and foundation. So I have just been looking at a manuscript which is being published soon, about 400 or 500 pages of all of Abraham Kuyper's writing about economics and business, in which he is emphasizing that every child until 50 years ago in Holland memorized, was asked, it was part of the school curriculum, Heidelberg Catechism, where you understood the 10 Commandments. The commandments that have been deleted by the Supreme Court in America, where Hollywood can now teach greed is good, in the first Wall Street movie, in the movie called Wall Street with Michael Douglas, etc. That so when you have a diabolical teaching which is undergirding capitalism, you are setting yourself up, as James Cameron points out in his movie Avatar, that America becomes an American capitalism, greed-driven capitalism, backed by world's greatest army, becomes a terror not only to the planet but to the outer space. So there are two invisible hands. Adam Smith didn't talk about the second invisible hand, but what happened, the prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, was saying that yes, we are living in the kingdom of Satan. This is European kingdom, Italian kingdom, the kingdom of Rome, which is the kingdom of Satan. In this kingdom, we want God's kingdom to come, and we begin to do his will in our hearts. That's what transformed the economy, and that's what we've got to return to.
So you're making very big statements. Sorry, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
You're making very big statements, Vishal. These are statements that you have written about at great length in your books. And so if people disagree with you, I'm sure there'll be people who disagree with you listening to the program. Anyone who disagrees with you is invited, of course, to read your books and find out the background to the kinds of statements you're making. But I would like both Ram and Al to come in with any final thoughts they have before I turn to Vishal for the rounding up of this program. May I start with Ram? Any final thoughts from you, Ram, on this whole question of decision making in difficult times with partial information? The question has led us in many different directions, but let's just come back to that. Any final thoughts on decision making in tough times?
Yeah, I think for me, decision making in tough times, we have to ask ourselves on what are we rooting? What is the underlying? What are the underlying values that are driving our decision making? And sadly, I must say, greed is good is still a dominant force despite the pandemic. What I hear from the City of London, from New York, and from other places is greed is good is driving it. That hand continues to drive the economy. And until and unless we acknowledge that there needs to be that counterbalancing with values that will address the bigger good of society, we're going to continue to find a situation where a very few will own as much as countries' wealth in the hands of a few people. So what we've got is right now with Amazon and Microsoft and Bezos and Gates and others is a few billionaires who effectively have as much as, for example, a dozen or 24 countries. Now that can't be right. Something has to address the shift of power and balance, or otherwise, what does one vote for one person mean when it is the dollar or the pound or the euro that is controlling where society goes? We've got to counterbalance it. I believe there is hope. The message that has to spread is you and I have to engage and make that difference, or else we may as well give up.
No, we don't give up. We continue the fight. And
Exactly.
Al, any final thoughts from you on continuing the good fight for humane values and so on?
Think back to the teachings of Jesus recorded in the book of Matthew in the Bible. He laid out 8 traits, 8 cultural traits. I won't go through them all, but the first one is blessed are the poor in spirit, which speaks to humility. I believe that humility on the part of leaders is absolutely fundamental. That's the only way we can put other interests ahead of ourselves, is if we have humility. The last one he speaks to is courage. And I believe in this world that we're in, it takes courage to walk in the way that we have talked about. I think it's easy to do the kind of things that we've talked about in a business when things are going well. When things are in very difficult straits, then what do? And that calls for courage. And it's easy to give up. That's why I think these spiritual anchors are so important, because I think when it gets difficult and you see no way out, how do you make this decision that's in the best interest of others other than yourself? So I think it does call for a spiritual renewal. It calls for a reminder of how this works. It calls for illustrations like what you just said about examples. What I wrote about in a company that actually worked over 70 years is built around all of these principles. I think all of us need to kind of pull back and say, what are we really trying to do here? And how do we deliver this value not for ourselves, but for everyone?
That's great, Al. Thank you very much. Can I turn to Vishal now? Vishal, could you just fill us in very few minutes, very few sentences, where the idea for these coronavirus live talks started and how it developed, and what is our purpose with these discussions?
Thank you. When coronavirus hit big time and the press sensationalized it, there were many conspiracy theories that began floating around, and unfortunately, many Christians were championing, promoting those conspiracy theories. And it became very clear to a group of us, Hans-Joachim Hahn, who's not here with us, he was included in that what we need is to seek wisdom. None of us are experts, and experts are disagreeing, and the leaders have to listen to experts, but leaders have their own compulsions, particularly in a place like America with elections coming on and the media being so polarized that you can't trust. As the president says, the media has become fake news, post-truth journalism, where you cannot trust either side, that they are being honest, that we need wisdom, and therefore we need to listen to experts. So we've listened to 2 experts today on how decisions should be made. And these principles need to be heard by the decision makers. They have very difficult job. But we've also listened to experts from science, from medicine, from healthcare, from economy, from technology, the impact of COVID-19. All of those lectures and live discussions are on YouTube and Facebook. As Al mentioned, that one response is, the first response is humility. Blessed are the poor in spirit. We need to humble ourselves. We don't understand everything, and we need wisdom, not conspiracy theories, to arrive at decisions personally, family, but as voters, and then as writers, thinkers, speakers. So that is the purpose, and this is part of the education revolution that some of us are engaged in an education which is teaching greed is good, which is eradicating, removing the foundations of why a prime minister should be the first servant, why a nation should not be ruled by king but by a president who is presiding amongst a group of equals, etc. Where did these principles come from, which have created great nations? And if all the nations have to receive the same light, what do we need to know and understand? So the purpose of these live discussions has been to take the time to listen to people who have expertise in some area, to collectively develop a mindset, learning and growing, with the hope of eventually impacting nations through the curriculum that we are developing, and equipping every church to become a classroom Monday to Friday, where truth and virtue, veritas and virtues, are reintegrated in education, as education itself has now become a tool of the market to produce workers. We want education to be go back to discipling nations, bringing them under the discipline of God, to where character is built up, citizenship is built up. So that's a larger program of bringing the civilizing education as a force for civilizing, where people are learning to seek God's kingdom. And this live discussion is part of developing our understanding and building up the team of people who could help create those curriculums and lead a new education revolution. So thank you very much. I have just moved into our daughter's home, and setting up the computer took some time, so I wasn't there with you in the beginning. But
that's fine. Thank you. Thank you for making time in the middle of this obviously difficult situation of being in the middle of a house move. So thank you for that. And thank you for drawing our attention to the wider purpose of these talks, which is to focus our minds on humane values, on how we can develop a culture which will work towards the benefit of humanity as a whole. So we have been discussing that these are all things which go back to deep matters of the heart. They're not just a matter of what you memorize. It's not just a matter of what you think at a particular moment, but these are deep matters of the heart. So let's ask Al, if you don't mind, to talk to God for all of us on the program, people who've been working behind the scenes and people listening to the program, that the deep things of our heart will be transformed from the kingdom of Satan, as Vishal put it, from the darkness to the light, from selfishness to what is good and will enable humanity as a whole to prosper. Would you, Al?
Dear God, we thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. We thank you that your leadership in our lives is designed to produce good. We thank you for Jesus Christ. We thank you that he can make a difference in all of our lives. And we thank you that it doesn't just stop with a religion, but it's a way of life, a way of thinking that is for the good of all. We pray that this would be transforming for all of us individually, for the organizations with which we work, and for our society, that we would see a way that would bring others along, not just ourselves, to the glory of God. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Very good. Well, thank you very much to Vishal in the middle of his house move for taking the time. For Al, for getting up early in the morning, your time, to participate in this. For Ram, giving up your time. Of course, all of us are very busy and helping, contributing to this program. I want to thank also our backstage team, Andreas Wieland, and the others who are helping him, both Finn and Tammo, and everybody else who's involved. Thank you very much. And I ask your indulgence for anything that I have done which has not been quite right, but it's been a difficult situation today, technically and in other ways. So I hope that we've all enjoyed the program nevertheless, and look forward to our next program. Thank you. Bye for now. God bless.